Hi, everyone, and thanks so much for tuning in to this very special episode of the Appalachian Storyteller. Today, we have 3 brand new stories from Master Storyteller, Granny Tollett. Let's get started. The leaves were just starting to turn on the trees that covered Emery Gap, and the air had that first edge of autumn on it. I had rushed and finished up my homework so I could spend the rest of the afternoon helping Granny Tollett drag the last of her sweet potato vines out of the garden bed and pile them up for burning. "Granny, did you know school started today?" I said as I worked alongside of her. "Yeah, honey, I know. I saw all the youngins lined up at the bus stop this morning at the end of the road. How's your new teacher?" "Well, he's smart enough, I reckon. He knows a lot about books and things, but you can tell he ain't from East Tennessee, 'cause he sure don't talk like us." Granny straightened up, and she looked at me with the expression she gets when something has reminded her of something else entirely. Then she pulled off her garden gloves and sat down on an old stone wall at the edge of the bed. "Now, J.D., it ain't right to talk about a new teacher like that, but I know exactly what you mean. Did I ever tell you about Mr. Harlan Baymont and the year he came up from Atlanta to teach here in Roane County?" "No, ma'am, I don't reckon you have," I said as I sat down on the wall beside her, eager to listen to another one of Granny's stories. Now, Mr. Baymont was a fine-looking young man. I'll give him that. Oh, he was tall and neat, with his hair combed down nice and flat, and dressed in business suits, like he was some kind of loan officer down at a bank or something. All us youngins had never seen such a person, standing right there in front of the chalkboard in our little school. He had a certificate from some far-off college, framed up, and he had tacked it on the wall, front and center of the classroom so all the students would see it. Truth be told, that sheepskin didn't impress us all that much, but he sure was proud of his education, and he didn't mind if you knew it. Well, anyhow, he showed up on the first day of school in a brand new suit, and then he stood at the front of that little schoolhouse and looked out at all us youngins. 22 in all, ranging from age 6 to 14. All of us had been raised on a farm for our entire lives. Matter of fact, most of us had been up since 4 that morning doing chores before our parents would even allow us to come to school. But Mr. Baymont, he wasted no time and got right down to the business of education. "Good morning, children. My name is Mr. Baymont, and I'm here to teach you how to think." And I'll never forget, right then and there, Dora Petty, who was 10 years old and Silas Petty's youngest daughter, looked up from her writing slate and said, just as politely as you please, "Excuse me, Mr. Baymont, I don't mean to interrupt, but we already know how to think. What else do you got?" Well, that startled the city teacher, and undoubtedly, he had been rehearsing exactly how he would start the first day of school for weeks and weeks in his mind. So he quickly pivoted and promptly announced that the school day would begin with a lesson of arithmetic. But you see, it was clear as a bell that Mr. Baymont, well, he didn't understand us children, and it took him all day to start figuring it out. We could do sums in our heads faster than he could write them on that board. Honey, anyone who lives on a working farm can, because you spend your whole life calculating how much seed for how many acres, how many jars to put up for the months, and how many board feet of lumber to patch a barn wall. And each time Mr. Baymont wrote a problem up on that chalkboard with fancy long division and big numbers, he would proudly turn around, expecting blank faces. But instead, he'd find that everyone was already done and sitting there with their hands folded, waiting on him. And child, that right there, it unsettled him. But like any veteran teacher, he quickly regrouped, and then he tried geography. He unrolled a fine, big map that he had brought with him from the city. Oh, it had all the states on it, along with their capitals and all the major rivers. And then he began quizzing us on these far-off places. He just knew that children who had most likely never left their farms would certainly struggle identifying distant cities. He decided to try Dora Petty again. So He asked her to come stand in front of the class and point out where they lived on the map. And JD, I tell you, child, she went straight up there and put her finger right on the spot without hesitating. And then to top it off, she looked right at the new teacher and said, "Mr. Baymont, can you show me where Barlow Holler is?" And he just stood there, searching for words, but he didn't have any answers. He just stared at that map before finally saying, "Well, I don't believe that's on here." "Well, what about Cutshaw Creek? Or Turkey Branch? Do you know the name of the gap over Clinch Mountain? The one where the old road cuts through?" Once again, not a single one of those places were on his fancy map, and all the while, he stood there speechless. And Dora? Well, she just turned around and went back and sat down. She didn't say another word about it, but every child in that room understood what had just happened. But Mr. Baymont pressed on. Oh, he wasn't the type of man to give up easy. I'll say that much for him. So he quickly began teaching natural science and commenced to telling the children about plants and their properties, reading straight from a shiny book that he had brought with him. And he got about 4 pages in before 8-year-old Caleb Ramsey raised his hand and asked if the book had anything to say about yellow root tea for a sore throat, or whether poke salad had to be boiled twice before it was safe to eat, or which side of the hickory tree grew moss on, and what that told you about which direction you were going. But Mr. Baymont, well, his book didn't address nary one of those things. So Mr. Baymont pivoted again. This time, he'd try vocabulary words for a while. He proceeded to write one big city word after another on the board. Precarious, parliamentary, luminescent, and then he would explain what each meant, as the children just scrunched their eyebrows, but wrote it down anyhow and did the best they could with it. Now we're making progress, Mr. Baymont thought. This is what learning is all about. But my hand afore the good Lord, even before it happened, I just knew Dora Petty wasn't going to keep quiet when it came to vocabulary quizzes. And I looked across the room and saw that she had already put her chalk down and was clearing her throat when she raised her hand again. "Excuse me, Mr. Baymont, since we're all here learning new helpful words, perhaps you can explain to us children what a cant hook is." "A cant hook? What on earth is that?" the teacher asked. And then Dora hit him again. "What about a single tree? Can you define that for us so we can write it on our chalkboards?" But he was clueless. "What about a spud bar, a swedge block, or a corn sheller?" Child, Dora might as well have been talking in Greek. And then she said, "Well, I reckon we both got a list of words to work on." And then she went back to her slate. Oh, it was clear. He needed to rethink his entire strategy. So he promptly announced that it was time for a recess. And all the while we were playing outside, Mr. Baymont was inside, busy studying his notes. He had read something in a teaching pamphlet about the importance of connecting learning to everyday experience. So he announced that the rest of the day would be dedicated to learning activities and took the entire class out behind the schoolhouse, where he would demonstrate the proper technique for splitting firewood. After all, this would serve as a lesson in both physics and practical self-sufficiency. But bless his heart, from the very first time he swung that axe, it was clear that he had never done so before. Child, he couldn't split that wood. He swung 6 times, and the log, well, it just sat there, more or less unimpressed. So he adjusted his grip and tried again. But the tool just glanced off sideways as the 7th swing stuck in the dirt, and Mr. Baymont stood there, trying to catch his breath, while the children just waited in polite silence. It was then that Clara Huff, who was 11 years old, and she was big for her age, and she had been stacking wood since she was 7, she said, "Mr. Baymont, do you want me to show you?" And then, child, that gal proceeded to split 4 logs in a row, plumb clean through, before she set that axe down and went back to her place in line. And just like that, the first day of school ended. Mr. Baymont sat in that empty schoolhouse for a long while after all the children had left. And whatever he was thinking about, the entire experience had seemed to rearrange something inside of him. Because when he came back the next day, he didn't unroll a map or even open his fancy natural science book. Instead, he asked all the children to tell him about Barlow Holler, and then he inquired about the plants around the school and which ones could be used for medicine and which ones would make you sick and what the difference between the two looked like. He asked Dora Petty how her daddy figured the corn yield on a hillside field where no two rows were the same length. And those children, they talked for the better part of that entire morning while he just listened and wrote things down in his little notebook. And as I recollect, that was the best day of school that any of us had had. Now, he didn't stop teaching his regular lessons. He still taught us to read better and to write a proper letter. But what he realized was that he too could learn from us. And in that way, we could actually all learn together. Now, being a teacher wasn't about wearing fancy clothes and college degrees. Instead, it was about genuinely caring for your students and listening to them. Granny Tollett paused for a moment and looked out over the ridge where the sourwoods were going red above the tree line over Emery Gap. And just then she said, "JD, my advice is just to go easy on your new teacher and give them an opportunity. Chances are that they're learning just as much about you as you are about them. Who knows, child? Maybe someday you might grow up and become some fancy or even famous teacher yourself. But son, don't you ever forget this. No matter how you feel about yourself, don't ever get any higher than corn and no lower than cotton. Always remember where you came from, son, and be yourself. And your students, well, they will love you for it." Now, neither one of us had a clue at the time that I would, in fact, one day become a teacher and end up teaching thousands of children over the course of a 21-year career. But I can tell you this, Granny's advice on how to be a good teacher was something that I never forgot. Stick around, folks. We've got 2 brand new stories coming right up. JD, child, why aren't you in school today? Well, Granny, I got myself a head cold. A head cold? Well, law, child, why didn't you say so? With that, she disappeared into the house and quickly came back with a little brown bottle that smelled awful strange. And she held it out to me with the satisfaction of a woman who has never once doubted her own remedies. "What in the world is that?" I said. "Don't you fret about that, son. It's just pennyroyal and balsam oil, and just a little something else that I put in there for good measure. Ain't nary a thing in there that'll kill you. Just drink it." "But Granny, that smells like something died in it." "Well, fine, suit yourself. Drink it or not. But don't come running back to me complaining about your head next week," she said as she feistily set the bottle on the porch rail and settled back into her rocker. "You're getting to be just as bad as your Papa Coy. All my life, I've had the worst trouble convincing that man to take medicine, except for that one time the professor came through Emery Gap. Come to think of it, did I ever tell you the story about Professor Chadwick and his marvelous nerve invigorator and mystery tonic?" "Well, no, I don't think so," I said as I took the chair next to her and leaned in for another story. "Well, child, it was a fine August, warm and clear. Pert near everybody in Roane County was in a fair mood on account of it. As I recollect, that was the summer that Amos Johnson's back had gone out on him for the 3rd time. Oh, he had wrenched it up by pulling a stump, and now he was walking around all bent sideways like a question mark, and complaining about it to anyone who would hold still long enough to listen. Well, one Saturday morning, a wagon came up the big road that none of us had ever seen before. Oh, it was painted red and yellow, loud as a circus, with letters so big and so gold that you could read them halfway down the holler. Professor Adorius P. Chadwick, it said across the top, and below that, marvelous nerve invigorator and mystery tonic, nature's own remedy for all that ails. Oh, he claimed that it cured everything from rheumatism to poor circulation to a nagging housewife. Professor Chadwick himself was up on the wagon seat and suited in the color of a ripe eggplant. And directly, he pulled right up in front of Otis Johnson's store and commenced to boasting about his miracle cure. Oh, he had a big, booming voice, like a church organ played in a small room, all while using fancy words that most of us had no clue what they meant, but they sure sounded authoritative. And by the time he'd been going on for the better part of 5 minutes, there were 30 men standing in the road listening. Oh, he talked about the liver, then he talked about the blood, before talking about something called the vital animating force, which could become sluggish through ordinary tribulations of mountain life, hard work, poor weather, worry, and grief. And then he held up his marvelous nerve invigorate, which he claimed was formulated from 17 secret biotonical ingredients, which he had personally learned from a Cherokee elder. This medicine was specifically designed to replenish and restore anything that might ail a man and set his spirit to singing like a freshly strung fiddle. Now, us women of the Harmony Chapel Baptist Church, well, we just stood there in the back of the crowd with our arms folded. And I'll never forget the look on Sally Ann's face. She was standing next to me, and her eyes had gone that particular narrow that they always go when she's doing all she can to bite her lip and keep from saying what's really on her mind. Meanwhile, Martha Amos leaned over all quiet-like and whispered, "Sally, his medicine has 17 secret ingredients. Why, that sounds amazing, don't it?" But Sally, well, she wasn't impressed, and the only thing she said in response was, But the menfolk, on the other hand, honey, they were pressing forward and hanging on to every single word the professor had to say. Then he pulled out the bottle of his famous elixir. It was a brown glass with a label that had an eagle on it. And then he uncorked it and let a few of the closer men smell it. And then he carried on. "Gentlemen, the botanical potency of this formula, it's considerable. The body recognizes it as medicine. The body knows what the mind sometimes resists. And as a courtesy to all you gentlemen gathered here today, I will offer the first free bottle to any man on this road who will give it a fair trial and report back honestly at next Saturday's return visit." Now, JD, free is a powerful word in any community. And the professor, well, he knew it. And he proceeded to hand out 11 bottles. Amos Johnson took 2, one for his back and one for his nerves. Homer Blevins, he took one for his bad knee. And all us womenfolk just stood there watching as 3 of the church deacons each took one. Just like that, the professor hitched up his wagon and drove on up the road, all while promising to return the following Saturday for testimonials and additional purchases. Well, anyhow, as I recollect, the next day was Sunday, and all those men had spent the entire night before trying out this mystery medicine. And I'll tell you right now, this was one of the most remarkable church services that I had ever sat through. Preacher Parson Page, he had barely finished his opening prayer when he asked if anyone in the congregation had any good news to share. That's when Amos Johnson cleared his throat and stood up from his pew, all proud-like, and proceeded to announce that he felt it was his Christian duty to share what had happened to him the night before regarding his back. He said he had drank the entire contents of both bottles of marvelous nerve tonic faithfully all night long, and now a warmth had spread throughout his back and loosened it up to the degree that he had not thought possible by natural means. Then he walked in front of the church and faced us all and proceeded to bend down and touch his toes, demonstrating his newfound flexibility. Next, Homer Blevins stood up and started singing the praises about his knee and how it had drastically improved. And then, out of nowhere, he started doing jumping jacks to prove it. Us women folks did the best we could to stay quiet as we listened. Deacon Carroll swore that his circulation was better and that his hands were no longer cold in the morning. Brother Petty said that he felt 10 years younger with a single bottle of the miracle medicine. And then, to demonstrate it to us women, every man in the church, even your Papaw Coy, stood at the pulpit and one by one They took turns drinking down a shot of the medicine before passing the bottle to the next fella, and afore long, they were smiling like a basket of chips and speaking so incoherent that you'd have thought they were speaking in tongues. Well, anyhow, as soon as that service was over, I saw that Sally Ann wasn't one bit convinced, and she immediately set out to get her hands on one of those bottles. And by Wednesday, she had one, and she took it straight to Knoxville and had one of them city doctors sit down and examine it to see what those famous secret ingredients were. And lo and behold, he took a single whiff of it and just started laughing. Child, it turns out that primary secret ingredient was nothing more than corn whiskey with a splash of molasses. No wonder those menfolk were feeling so fine in church the other day. Granny fell back in her rocker, laughing so hard that she snorted. Child, needless to say, when that professor rolled into town that Saturday, he didn't sell a single bottle that day. And the only ones who came to greet him was a crowd of angry wives. And when they get through giving him a piece of their mind, well, he climbed back on that bright wagon and then got on down that road like he was a scalded cat. And we never saw him again. Granny wiped her eyes, still chuckling, and then she picked up the little brown bottle from the porch rail and held it out to me again. Now, J.D., you have my word that this here ain't whiskey. I'll promise you that. But it'll clear that head cold right up. So what'll it be, child? Are you going to be stubborn like your papa, or are you going to take your medicine? To this day, I don't know what Granny Tollett put in that bottle, but I drank it. And wouldn't you know it, I slept like a baby that night. And the next day, my head cold was completely gone. Sure sounds like that was one heck of a church service for sure. Don't go anywhere, folks. We got another brand new story coming right at you.
Give someone you love the gift of old-fashioned storytelling. 5 books for the young and old alike that will make your heart smile. Click the link below to order your copy of the Appalachian Storyteller today, also available on Amazon.
There was a large sycamore tree in Granny's front yard that Papa Coy had planted many years ago, and now it kept the porch in constant shade. Just then, I noticed that someone had nailed a sign onto it advertising a baptizing event down at the Harmony Chapel Baptist Church that was scheduled to take place next Sunday, and they were seeking candidates to be washed clean in the muddy banks of the Emory River. Granny, are y'all having a baptizing next week? I asked. Sure are, Granny said as she snapped another bean with authority. I recollect that there hadn't been one down at that bend ever since Brother Hensley's boy got saved 3 summers ago. She looked up from her work and gazed at the sign for a moment, almost as if she were lost in reflection, before she leaned back in her chair and chuckled so heartily that she had to push her spectacles back on her nose. And once she composed herself, she finally spoke. You know, J.D., I've sat through many a baptizing in my years, but the most memorable one that I ever witnessed in my life had nothing to do with the preaching. Law, child, did I ever tell you about that summer that Silas Petty brought his old mule to the baptizing? No, ma'am, I don't believe you have. With that, she started out. Now, you have to keep in mind that Silas Petty, well, he was never the type of man to do anything the simple way, especially if there was a more complicated way available to him. And for the life of me, I never understood it. You see, most folks, when they come to a baptizing, they would go on foot or ride a wagon and leave their animals tied up at the church. But not Silas. As I recollect, that summer he had acquired himself a new mule. Her name was Jezebel. Now that right there should tell you all you need to know. But Jezebel was a big gray Missouri mule, just as broad as a barn door, with ears that stood up like she was receiving signals from somebody that no one else could see or hear but her. And honey, That mule was dead set in her ways. Oh, she'd pull a load if she felt like it, but if she didn't feel like it, there was no argument that you could make that she would ever find persuasive. And you talk about being ornery. Why, she bit Silas at least once a week, which I guess most folks felt was the most useful thing she did. But anyhow, Silas rode Jezebel to the baptizing that Sunday morning and tied her to a poplar tree down on the bank. And then he came over to join the rest of us, lined up along the creek. Child, I can see it now. It was a beautiful day. The Lord had painted a pretty blue sky and provided a gentle breeze as we gathered next to a picture-perfect clear creek. Everything was perfect, and there was Parson Page, already wading out in his baptizing clothes, with his Bible raised up, ready to receive the first candidate. And as I recollect, there were 7 souls to be baptized that morning. 7 beautiful souls, ready to be washed clean and born again. Oh, it was going to be a long, good service, and everybody knew it. But we didn't mind, because we knew this was the Lord's business, and nobody was in a hurry. Well, anyhow, the first candidate was Polly Tucker, and she went in without incident. The second one was Tommy Lawson. Oh, he was a little reluctant and came up sputtering. Now, the third one was old man Ezekiel Gibson. Oh, he was about 70-something years old, and he'd been putting off getting baptized for the better part of 5 decades. And there he was, gripping Parson Page's arm so tight that Parson later said that his hand went numb. But somehow, they managed to get it done. All the while, the entire congregation stood on the bank singing, "Shall we gather at the river?" Oh, child, the Spirit was certainly moving. But that's when Jezebel expressed her opinion about the whole ordeal. Now, we never could determine exactly what it was that set her off. Some folks blamed a yellow jacket that got too close to her ear. Other folks said it was probably Ezekiel's hollering when he went under. But Silas Petty, well, he maintained that it was the singing that actually spooked her. But whatever it was, honey, Jezebel's rope came loose from that poplar tree, and if you ask me, to this very day, I believe she untied it herself, because that mule was smarter than she let on. And once she did, she walked down the creek just as calm as a Sunday morning, and then proceeded to wade out into the water towards the preacher. Afore you could say scoot, she planted herself right there in the middle of the creek, about 6 feet from Parson Page, who was standing there with the 4th baptizing candidate, a young woman named Effie Carroll, and she had been nervous about the whole proceeding to begin with. And Jezebel, well, she looked at them both while her big mule ears swiveled forward like she was waiting to see what would happen next. Effie was so terrified of that animal that she let out a scream so loud that I swear they heard her plumb up the ridge. And then Effie tore out of that creek, and then she ran up the bank and flat out refused to go back in. All the while, there was Silas Petty hollering, "Jezebel, you get out of there. Come here, you Jezebel." Now, child, I want you to consider the scene. There was Silas standing on the bank of the creek at a church baptism, hollering Jezebel at the top of his lungs, over and over, while a mule was standing next to the preacher. Just think of the effect this had on the congregation. I mean, half the people on the bank were from the Methodist church, and they didn't know Silas had a mule by that name. And one woman, well, she fainted clean away and had to be revived with somebody's hat used as a fan. And Brother Abner Collins, well, he was hard of hearing, and he hadn't been fully following the events anyway. And he leaned over to his wife and said, "Is Parson Page casting out a devil?" And his wife just said, "Hush, child." But Abner went on, "Well, somebody's out there hollering about a Jezebel, and there's a woman running out of the creek." Meanwhile, out in the water, Parson Page was doing his level best to maintain the dignity of the occasion, which was getting harder by the minute. He let 4 more souls out there to baptize, with a mule standing in his baptizing spot. And every time he tried to ease around that mule and get into deeper water, Jezebel would shift sideways and block him out of pure meanness. Levi Sutherland, who fancied himself capable with livestock, waded out in the water to assist. But Jezebel, she waited until he had both his hands on her, and then she walked upstream with him before she suddenly stopped and sent Levi flying face first into the creek in his best Sunday suit. And that left Parson Page in a difficult position. That water was chest deep where he was, and the bank was slick clay. All the while, Jezebel was standing between him and the shallow end of the crossing. Every time that preacher would get around her, the mule would move again. And by now, the congregation had stopped singing altogether and was standing with the remaining candidates, bumfuzzled at the ongoings in the creek. Now, it was Sally Ann that organized the rescue. Well, because it's always Sally Ann. She directed 4 of the larger men to form a line across the creek, downstream. And then she sent Silas Petty, who had been standing on the bank the whole time hollering Jezebel, into the water to approach from the upstream side. The plan was to ease the mule towards the shallows. So Silas waded in. All the while that mule just watched him. And as soon as that old man got within arm's reach of her, she lowered her head and shoved him in the chest with her nose, just as pretty as you please. And down Silas went into the creek, so hard that the splash knocked down the 3 closest men in Sally Ann's rescue line. All of them went in sideways, causing the last man to also crash into the water. I tell you, for a moment, that creek was so full of people, you'd have thought the entire church was getting baptized all at once. And Parson Page, God bless him, was still holding his Bible above his head through all of it, trying to keep it from getting wet. Well, anyhow, it was ultimately Hattie Ledford who solved the problem when she grabbed a bucket of feed corn from the back of her family's wagon and started rattling it. And old Jezebel's ears swiveled towards that sound like a compass finding north, and just turned around and walked right out of the water. And there she stood on the bank, eating her corn, while 6 waterlogged men pulled themselves out of the creek behind her. Silas was finally able to get a hold of her and tie her up again, only this time he used 3 separate ropes. And Sally Ann just looked at him and said, "Silas, next time you bring an animal anywhere near a church service, I will see to it personally that she gets baptized too, and maybe it'll help her disposition." And Silas, well, he didn't say anything to that, which was probably the smartest thing that man had done all day. Wow, that was one baptizing at the river that I'm sure no one ever forgot. Thanks so much for watching this episode, everyone. Be sure to drop a comment below and let me know which story you liked the most. Be sure to hit the like and subscribe button too. I'll see you on the next story.